Welcome to Global Perspectives. At each turn in today's world, we seem to run into unwillingness. Is there a solution? Author James Backus has the answer in his new book, The Willing World.
Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to the show, Jim.
Well, thank you very much, John. It's good to be here.
The Willing World sounds like such a refreshing title in an environment of such contentiousness. Can you tell us how you arrived at that title and where you took it?
I believe I have a duty of optimism. I believe we all do. This is not an original thought with me. This is Karl Popper, but I've always believed it. And mine is an optimistic book. Yes, we live in an unwilling world, but we need to find our way toward one that's willing to confront the challenges we face as a world, and as 7 billion people and more. We live in a time of great economic uncertainty. There are more than 1 billion people in the world who are still living in poverty, and there's several billion more who don't know whether they'll have a job tomorrow or whether they'll ever get a pay increase. At the same time, we live in a world of increasing certainty about the reality of climate change. Climate change is not just coming, it's here, it's arrived, and it's already beginning to change every aspect of what we do economically and socially, as well as, of course, altering all our environmental ecosystems.
And there are some who say, and you're one of them, and you do so in this book, that climate change and the economy, or the environment and the economy, really are inextricably linked.
A key to helping find and shape and share in a willing world is to realize that the economy and the environment are actually one. Our future economically cannot be separated from our future environmentally. This is what sustainable development is all about achieving opportunities for all of us worldwide, economically and environmentally and socially. So we need to figure out how best to do that. And my view is that the best way to do it is through all kinds of volunteer and other cross-cutting efforts at the grassroots of the world that can innovate in local communities everywhere and in regions everywhere, and can then be linked up and scaled up to be able to achieve our goals globally. And I think this can only be done within a framework of enabling rules, not laws that are imposed from above, but rules and laws that emerge from our own experience in these innovative endeavors all over the world.
For those who may not immediately make the connection between the economy and the environment as you have, could you provide an example of something, maybe something dramatic, that is happening today where the two are obviously linked?
Well, I'll just mention something very practical: food. We all depend on food. We depend on agriculture, whether we think much about it on any given day or not. But agriculture is only going to succeed here and everywhere else unless it's increasingly done sustainably. If we continue as we are with our agricultural forms of production for the foreseeable decades, then we won't have nearly enough food to feed people in the world by the year 2050. We have to change to sustainable agriculture, which means all kinds of changes in the way we relate to our environment, such as how we deal with water, for example, and water management.
Food is one of those interesting topics that seems to evolve, and it's connected to the relative prosperity of an economy. I remember early on when I first visited China, every single item was used to the max. If you had an animal that was used for food, you cut it up and you didn't waste anything. But with the passage of time and the increasing prosperity of the Chinese economy, and then you've got a whole generation of haves now who are not as careful as they used to be about using food efficiently, and there's actual waste. How does that factor in the whole issue of waste in the food production and use issue?
One of the biggest issues we face in the world is the fact that so much of our food is wasted. It can be as much as a third of what we produce. The most waste, for the reasons you suggested, is in developed countries such as our own. And a key way to achieve sustainable development is to diminish the amount of food we waste.
Is in the short term, before we reach a point where we're doing all of that efficiently, is there something that we can do with food before it spoils so that it is used in some way, whether it's, you know, giveaways to people in need or something else? It just seems tragic to, you know, go behind restaurants and other institutions that serve or process food and to see the waste piled up in the back.
Well, this is something that's already happening as one of those examples of grassroots efforts that I mentioned in many parts of our country, and increasingly being emulated elsewhere in the world. A lot of restaurant food that's not served is given away and is used elsewhere for those who are hungry and needy and who need it. You know, this is something that has been an innovation in a few places, and now is being used worldwide, and increasingly so, even in China.
You were talking about the need for this willing world to evolve under the umbrella of the rule of law, and for it not to be imposed. It has to be something that people embrace, or it's going to be difficult for it to be successful. How do you do that? Obviously, top-down doesn't work. This is something that sounds like it has to emanate from, as you were saying, the grassroots level. And how do people at the grassroots begin to organize in ways that can produce such constructive change?
Well, take climate change as one example of what we're trying to do with the Sustainable Development Goals that all the members of the United Nations have embraced. Climate change is Goal 13, doing something about it that will work. I've been much involved in the climate movement, working with the United Nations and with others on legal aspects of a new Paris Climate Agreement and more. There are two views within the climate community of activists who are trying to create a willing world in which we have addressed climate change. One is that there's going to be some grand global solution that will be reached at some global summit that will then be announced to the world, and all the world will fall into ranks and make it a reality. That's not my view. I'm of the other view, which is that the solution for climate change is to find innovative solutions at the grassroots of the world through innovation, through especially market-based solutions, but also through a lot of cross-cutting, multi-stakeholder, as they say, networks of volunteers and activists, sometimes government being involved, sometimes not, civil society of all kinds, universities, scientists, educators, especially business. In this way, we can find ways that work. We can then announce them by linking them up to the rest of the world, and then they can be emulated elsewhere where they can also work. There are many different kinds of nuances to these issues worldwide. But in order to make this happen in a way that we can scale it up globally, we have to do so, in my view, within enabling legal framework. This is all about freedom and how we have human flourishing that will work not just for our generation, but for future generations. And freedom can only exist within the rule of law in all its manifestations. So sustainable development can only occur within the rule of law. But that solution also cannot be imposed from above. It must develop over time through experimentation, innovation, through learned experience, learning by doing, that can then be reduced to writing and rules that can provide a framework in which we then can succeed in what we are trying to do locally, regionally, nationally, and globally.
Part of the challenge is bringing the parties that are on opposite sides of this issue together. And you have a very reasoned, non-confrontational, almost serene style that I think would, at the very least, cause someone to listen. But the parties in these discussions aren't always like that. Oftentimes they're at extremes, and there's more yelling than talking and listening. How do you bring them to the table so that there can be a civil exchange? And that seems to be a problem generally in today's world, that civility is often absent.
My approach has always been, whether in the Congress or as a judge on the World Trade Court or in any other public service in which I've been engaged, to take a certain kind of approach. I have always tried to appeal to the best in people and not the worst. I've tried to bring people together and not pull them apart. I've tried to find common ground and then build a consensus on that common ground that leads to a solution. This is one reason perhaps why every single judicial ruling of the World Trade Court, the WTO appellate body, while I was a judge and chief judge, was unanimous. It was by consensus. This is hard to do. It takes a lot of patience. It takes being willing to listen as well as talk. It certainly takes an effort to separate the deed from the person doing it. The opinion that you might fervently disagree with or disavow from the person voicing that opinion. You have to go beyond that to try to find that common ground. And I think above all, it's important to do so civilly, to do so with mutual human respect. I've been in politics and competitive elections, and I can certainly play hardball politics, but for me it's always about the issues and not the people involved. I think that makes a difference, and I've found that it makes a difference, and I think that's what we have to do not only in our communities and in our country, but in the entire world.
How do you restrain yourself if you're in a situation where you feel that you're becoming angry? I've known you for many, many years, and I've seen you emphatic and forceful, but never angry, at least in public. And is there anything that moves you to anger? And is that ever an appropriate part of a conversation?
Well, I'm human, and I feel anger all the time. The challenge is to control anger and channel it in some positive way. That's the only way that you can actually make a contribution. Merely expressing anger, to my mind, doesn't really accomplish much of anything. There's much in the world now to be angry about, to be sure, but we're only going to change the world and make a willing world if we channel our disappointment, our anger, our distrust, our dismay into something positive. And that means working together with people with whom we may not agree.
So what would be a starting point in a typical community? I mean, you talked about the need for people to work together on the climate change issue, but maybe something else that they can approach and tackle in pieces that doesn't seem as overwhelming as an issue like climate change.
Well, I have a great deal of faith in local solutions and therefore in the ability of local people to find solutions by working together. I think the first step is to bring people together to try to achieve some commonly sought result. I think it ideally would be some active project in which they would need to take action to make it happen, not just through talking, but through actually doing something. It may be a service project, building a children's playground, or helping the elderly, or tutoring disadvantaged kids. In this way, people begin to work side by side, and despite their differences, establish a bond. This is the secret to being able to find common solutions. Because once you have a common bond with people, even if there are disagreements, you have a basis of common ground for moving forward.
What would be an example of a local issue that you would hope to bring people together on in terms of ideas and solutions that could be scaled nationally or internationally that we haven't talked about yet?
There are any number of them, and they all relate in one way or another to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And this can be done locally everywhere and in every country, and it is being done. Millions of people are already engaged who know that they're working for these goals, and millions of others are engaged who don't realize that this is in furtherance of these goals. And they would include eliminating poverty, providing decent health care, improving education, assuring gender equity, ending hunger, as we've already discussed, bringing people together to find new kinds of energy solutions, both through innovative efforts to create new forms of clean energy, and also through energy efficiency efforts as well.
So talk to us about how the book specifically can address some of these challenges. What do you say to someone who says, oh great, another book, I've already got too much to read that I don't have time for? What would persuade them to crack the cover of this one and see what it holds inside?
There have been a great many good books written about sustainable development, and I applaud their authors. I think what separates my book is the particular approach I take in suggesting dozens and dozens of specific solutions that can be pursued. As I say in the book, I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I suggest many answers for how we can, for example, reimagine our international trade and investment rules to make them reflect our need for sustainable development. How we can reimagine our various international institutions to keep them from being separate silos and bring them together to try to work together to achieve sustainable development. And also how we can specifically work from the grassroots up, especially to achieve sustainable development.
Are you sufficiently confident in the solutions you propose that you could parachute into just about any community and get constructive conversations going?
Yes. Yes. And in fact, I've had many such conversations in many parts of the world. The nuances of the challenges we face are different in different parts of the world, but there are common challenges, climate change foremost among them, but other ways in which we're pushing up against the barriers of our various ecosystems, for example, in the loss of species and biodiversity. These issues may affect different people differently. There may be a different approach we need to take to protecting endangered sea turtles in the United States than in Indonesia. But there are probably also ways in which we can link up and together find better solutions for both places and show an example to the world of how we might protect that particular endangered species.
If you had to prioritize, what would be the three most important, most critical issues on your list?
The two most important on my list are ending poverty and confronting climate change. And the third, if I have to pick a third, would be the global partnerships that are needed everywhere in the world to be able to achieve those two goals and all of our other many goals for sustainable development globally.
And do you think that ending poverty is a goal that could be addressed and accomplished in the next X number of years? If you can put a number on it.
There are 197 members of the United Nations who have signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals. The first of those goals is not just to reduce poverty, but to end it, and not some distant time in the future, but by the year 2030. You may think this is impossible, but the truth of the matter is we have lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty in the past 20 years. We only have another 1.2 billion to go. It can be done if we work together as a world to do it.
And do you think that there is, when you talk about willingness and unwillingness, how can we tilt things in favor of willingness to end poverty? Obviously the partnerships matter, but can our political leaders and others do more in terms of their emphases, in terms of their speeches, in terms of their leadership on these issues?
Ultimately, it comes back to us and to the people we choose to represent us, and then to those who are supposed to represent us. We all have to stop looking at just the narrow and shorter view. We have to look to the broader and longer view, because in looking to the broader and longer view, we actually pursue our true enlightened self-interest. And we've had a hard time doing that. Of course, if you're without a job or without anything to eat, that presents the present in your mind. But the only way we can solve these enormous problems we face as humanity on this planet is to work together. And again, I don't think there's any summit at the top of the world that's going to be willing to do that. We have to create willingness step by step, piece by piece, and day by day in the communities of the world, everywhere in the world. And we have to be willing to elect those who say they want truly to lead us and are not just trying to appease us and our various prejudices and biases of the moment.
How do we get people to look beyond their own self-interest? Because a lot of individuals will defer to that before thinking about the collective good, and nations always seem to act first and foremost in their own interest, and then secondly in the interest of the rest of the world, if they move that far.
I think the first step, John, is to help these people get out and see something that they don't immediately perceive as being in their immediate and narrow self-interest. That's why I believe so much in community-based activism. When you go see how much poverty there is in your community, you begin to realize how it's affecting you and how it could affect you in the future. And you begin to realize, therefore, that it's in your interest to help address this challenge. The same thing with people who are hungry, the same thing with working alongside people who don't have basic health care and worry about getting sick. All of this affects every one of us, but we may not truly see it until we're out there trying to work alongside others and doing something about it. So one of the benefits, I believe, of hands-on citizenship through community-based activism is that we begin to look at our self-interest differently. We begin to see our self-interest as being a part of the broader and the longer term.
Let me ask a similar question from a different perspective. 2030 seems to be relatively close to me, but there are some who look at dire predictions as to what could happen with the environment or the economy or something else, and they say, well, that's too slow. We need to do these changes much faster. How do you respond to that? And is there a way to do things much faster? Or is 2030 a realistic goal?
Well, in terms of climate change and all of our goals and efforts being made everywhere to accelerate our progress. Certain national climate pledges, for example, have been made under the Paris Climate Agreement, but efforts are already underway to encourage nations to get more ambitious about what they're promising to do to address climate change. This is true also with all of these sustainable development goals. But simply looking at something and saying, well, this is going to be hard to do, is simply an excuse for not doing it. My friend Reuben Askew, former governor of Florida, who was my mentor, taught me many years ago that not being able to do everything is not an excuse for doing nothing. There's something all of us can do, and only if all of us begin to feel that way, only if we become willing to serve, to participate, to make a difference, will we ever have any hope of living in the willing world.
As we wrap up, you say you bring optimism to the conversation. Are you optimistic that all or many of the solutions that you propose in your book will actually happen?
Well, not tomorrow, but increasingly a number of these suggestions, on which I've been working already for the most part for some time, are beginning to get currency. For example, we now have 12 countries in support of disciplining fossil fuel subsidies under world trade rules. Well, we only have 152 to go in the WTO, but that's 12 more than we had a year ago, and we're off to a good start in this endeavor. We're much farther along in the same context with trying to discipline fishery subsidies that are promoting and contributing to declining fish stocks all over the world, and thus increasing numbers of hungry people.
Well, on that optimistic note, we'll end, and thank you for joining us today, Jim Backus.
My pleasure as always.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.